Ba 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 ba. Whew. I think when I was younger, I was sort of labeled as a kinky, sexual deviant sort of a guy, when ultimately probably I was just a little bit too open about things because of I don't know, autism or something. So definitely. Whatever the reason, I would say things. I would just say, whatever, right? And so, if even at one time, even if just once I got curious and I Googled something weird, I would just tell people about it because I had no shame. Shame has not, entered my mind at any point in the equation, and because of that, pretty quickly people were like, "Whoa, you're like a freaky sexual dude," That was the vibe. Kinky was sort of the atmosphere placed upon me, though, right? I don't know if that's true at this point. I'm not sure that's accurate to the actual depth of me. I think my interests are actually fairly mundane and normal, but it doesn't really matter. I definitely don't connect, even if I were kinky. I definitely don't connect with the culture of kinky people at this point in time. So the first big reason why I don't really vibe with kink culture these days, despite having some, kink culture-y friends in my life, is the problematization in kink community of various people's sexuality, right? So the way I would put it is the Venn diagram of people who were on Tumblr in 2013, who are very Tumblr social justice-y people, and people who self-identify as being into kink or in the kink community. It's basically a circle, right? It's not 100%, but there's a lot of overlap there. And as a result of that, a lot of the very essentializing identity politics stuff that I'm very critical of in politics at large trickles in to conversations about weird sex, right? And so you get to a place where if it's a white person having sex with a black person, and they want to do a little slavery role play, have a little slavery role play, people start to get all freaked out about it. I personally think if it's two consenting adults, you can do whatever you want. And so do they. So do the kink people. Until you start talking about things that make their racial justice, anti-racism alarm go off, and then they go, well, hold on, wait, maybe not. In general, I'm very critical of this concept of fetishizing someone being a bad thing. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think lots of different people have fetishes, quote unquote, to some degree for different types of looks of people. Racial fetishes, chasers, right? That's basically a trans fetishist, someone who is attracted to trans people specifically because they're trans. And it feels like there's this very, very small window that you're supposed to exist within these sort of social justice-y communities of being attracted to people of all types, right? Because if you're not, then the implication is that you think trans people are ugly or something like that, right? I mean, you're allowed to be attracted to who you're attracted to, but also, there's a little bit of why aren't you attracted to them, right? There's a little bit of that goes on. There's that skepticism that goes on. And then the other aspect is, on the other end, you can't fetishize. Personally, I don't think that makes sense. I think that should be up to individuals. I would love to be fetishized. If somebody was like, oh yeah, fat white dudes. Oh, I love fat dudes. Oh, I love that goatee you have. If that's somebody's fetish and they're into me for that, that's a win. That's a win in my book. Now, I'm not trying to impose that everybody needs to feel good about being fetishized in all circumstances, right? If you're being dated by someone and you're emotionally in love with them, and you get the distinct feeling that the only reason they're into you at all is because of some identity feature of yours, you're allowed to not like that. Of course you're allowed to be uncomfortable with that. You're allowed to end the relationship or have a conversation with them about it, communicate about it, try to get to, like, is this a relationship that can continue? If this is the only reason you're interested in me, of course. I understand and empathize with that. But the problem is when it becomes this external top-down sort of a dogma of don't fetishize people as like a rule of thumb that we commit ourselves to preemptively, and that ends up being just an excuse to cancel different people for having various forms of kinks. And this sort of dovetails nicely into my second criticism, which is a criticism of modernity and the formalization of social norms. I've said before that I think that political correctness is a kind of formalization of the process of being respectful towards someone. I think that you can be respectful towards someone without adhering rigidly to specific labels and specific rules of how you're supposed to talk, how you're supposed to act. I think that we can have like a respectful vibe towards people. I also think that you can say everything right and kind of follow all of the rules of political correctness and still be being disrespectful towards groups of people. Like, it goes both ways. And I think that the reason why we expect that these things can be turned into strict rules of never say this, never say retarded, for example, never say slurs. You know, the reason we think we can write formal rules like that has a lot to do with modern society being overly focused on rigid tools of measurement so that everything can be viewed from a bird's eye view from the top down. Cooking, for example, used to be done in this very like vibes-based way. Oh, a little bit of this, throw in a pinch of that, throw in some of this, right? And then when we started to have factories and we started to mass produce standardized products, the recipes needed to be followable by workers on the factory floor of every factory across multiple nations, across large supply chains, and then we had to find formal systems of measurement. And so, through processes of colonization, through processes of industrialization and modernization, we started to adopt this kind of ideology that the way we should understand how I should relate to you in a social setting should be dictated the same exact way as how I would bake a cookie in a factory setting. We should have social rules be dictated from the top down in a standardized way, in much the same way that our measurements for how we make little widgets at our workplaces every day is done. As it pertains to kink specifically, this becomes formal rules of not fetishizing people, that's a big one. And then another formal rule is consent. Consent is a formalization of the process of understanding and being on the same page as someone else. Of course, the ideal behind consent of making sure everybody is comfortable and enthusiastic and not taking advantage of anyone else, that ideal is correct. It is the formalization of that process to explicit verbal authentication, explicit verbal consent of every microscopic step in the process of sex that people take issue with. That is what people are always criticizing when they're criticizing consent culture, and that is modernity. That is what they are upset about. When they are criticizing kink culture, they are criticizing modernity, and they just don't have the words to say that that is what they are doing. In a way, it should be a thing that you do, and we've detached the community of kink from the thing that you do. And so instead, it's become a series of symbols of belonging to this community. And in a capitalist society, I would argue that what always happens when this is the case is those symbols become products that you can purchase. And so basically everyone who considers themselves like a member of the kink community, the way that they do being a member of the kink community is rarely anything to do with having lots of sex or having sex a specific kind of way. Rather, it is about collecting a lot of pieces of fashion and a lot of dildos. That's really, it's dildo collecting. Just call yourself dildo collectors. And I have no interest in dildo collection. That's not a hobby I am interested in pursuing. I think one real good one gets the job done pretty good in 90+% of circumstances. So I don't really see the need to have an endlessly expanding collection. I personally don't like leather. Leather has become symbolically the aesthetic of kink. There are lots of different kinks, right? Some people have like a fur kink. Some people have, there's lots of different materials, pantyhose or whatever, right? Lots of different materials. But leather has become symbolically attached to kink. And so not liking leather means that if you show up to a kink gathering, you're not going to be wearing the uniform. And if you're out of uniform, you look a little bit out of place and you feel a little bit out of place. So I'm not sure that I'm really going to fit in any of these spaces without the uniform on. I think I've talked before on this channel about the concept I have of the weaponization of asceticism. And what I mean when I say weaponizing asceticism is that we are kind of taught a lot of times to go without. Instead of trying to help people get more in life, we are taught to be happy and comfortable with less. We tell ourselves things like, well, you don't need a lot of money as long as you have family. That's what counts. And that's a good message. Sure, that's true. But if you're being told that by your boss when you're asking for a raise, and he says to you, well, you don't need a lot of money to be happy. Family, that's what counts. It feels a little bit different, right? A little bit of asceticism can go a long way towards making one appreciative of the life that they have, even if it's not perfect. And that's a good thing to have. It's not good to have this appreciation imposed upon you. To have satisfaction with a dissatisfying situation imposed upon you from without. With that in mind, there's a book called Existential Kink, which attempts to bridge the divide between Jungian shadow work and kink culture by arguing that we often desire pain, we often desire dissatisfaction, we often desire things that are undesirable, and we experience a lot of shame associated with those things. And so Jung would tell us to do shadow work, record this dark side, put it down, come to terms with our own dark side, and integrate it into ourselves. Become a full person who is unashamed of the things they want that would normally be shameful to them. And for kink culture, that means embracing the things that you're turned on by that you normally would be ashamed to be turned on by. Save me, somebody save me, you're screaming for life, I will never have. Woo! There we go. Hello? Are you there? This is me from the future. Clarification. When I say that consent is a formalization of trying to generally be respectful of other people sexually. That is, it requires an example. I think an example would be illustrative here, right? I was with a friend one time, and we had seen Rocky Horror Picture Show together with a group of friends. And we were in this group of friends, and the two of the friends were being a little bit extra flirty with each other. They're being a little touchy and flirty at the table, right? And then I think one of them did like a big old sex noise. Did a big sex noise at the table. It was very loud. and they were like kind of joking, but they were kind of being touchy with each other, so it was like kind of not a joke. It was like, oh, let's make it a joke so we can do it in public, kind of, sort of, right? So it was halfway between a joke and not a joke, but it was a little bit loud and kind of in a restaurant, right? And it only happened a little bit, and they were having fun, they were having a good time, and I was just kind of enjoying the general energy of it. I was just enjoying that they were having a blast. Friend of mine felt that in according to kink ethic terms, that was the wrong thing to do, because in her words, they didn't have the consent of the people in the restaurant. I'm not sure that makes a ton of sense. I think that's a little bit of an overbearing interpretation of the logic of consent to ask that people have the consent of a whole restaurant before making a little sex bone noise to be silly. I think that's an overbearing interpretation there, and I think that demonstrates the strictness of this concept in the minds of people within this community. It's me, Future Dominic, back with another clarification. In the section where I'm talking about problematizing people's sexuality, right? I've talked in a previous video about why I think this is an imposition from without, or from above would be a better way to put it. So let's say there's an age gap relationship. This was the example I'd given before. And one is, in theory, trying to protect the younger party. In this case, everybody's grown adults, right? There's just an age gap. Somebody's trying to protect the younger party from the older party because they feel that this age gap might mean something as predatory is going on, right? And I said that this implies a level of distrust on the part of this other grown adult, right? You're basically saying, I don't trust this other grown adult to be able to determine for themselves whether or not some kind of pseudo-grooming is happening here, right? And so the idea, in theory, of protecting a younger person from an older person, that's a good idea, right? But when they're two grown adults and they're in a relationship, it becomes a stigma. And people talk about having this stigma. People complain about this stigma. So I think it makes sense to ask ourselves, where are the origins of this problem that a lot of people are having? A lot of people in age gap relationships are having this problem of their relationship is stigmatized. And so if you get to the root of it is that people are trying to treat older people shouldn't date younger people as a rule that can be applied from the top down and applied from outside the relationship, instead of something for the people in the relationship to keep in mind. And that implies a level of distrust, which I think is fundamentally authoritarian in a political sense. Kink isn't just about sex. It's a weird sentence. I was introduced to this argument a few years ago, and I think it's correct, but maybe not in the way that the people saying it think it is. They're correct. Kink isn't just about sex anymore. Normally, when somebody says that, the types of things they want to point out are, first of all, the existence of people who are asexual, maybe. And sure, of course, if you're asexual and you get something enriching that is maybe pseudosexual or non-sexual from your perspective, out of a kind of sensory play that exists in the world of kink culture, I think that's fine, obviously. You're allowed to enjoy, I don't know, being tickled with a feather or punched in the butt or whatever. That's called impact play for the kids at home. Yeah, so I think that's allowed, of course, but it does sort of say something about what this word has come to mean for some people, right? Because originally, the meaning of the word kink, like if you just Google it, is like a thing you do to spice up sex. And that is what most of the things that are aesthetically tied to kink culture are. Spanking, leather, all of these things are common things that people enjoy adding into their sex life in the bedroom. They're things that people enjoy as an accoutrement to normal sex. And so to take this thing which was originally you're already having sex and then you add this on top of it to make it more exciting, and to give the stuff that you added on top of it a life of its own, to me, that's actually a little bit worrying. Because it says to me that we are attempting to sort of desexualize the last bastion of open sexuality. I've talked before on this channel about a sort of an empathy divide between people who are very interested in sex and people who are very not interested in sex, and how it's very easy to moralize this divide. If you're very interested in sex, then the people who are disinterested are prudish. If you're very disinterested, then the people who are interested are, in the case of women, sluts. In the case of men, objectifying pigs of sorts, right? Either way, the effect is basically the same. Somebody openly and earnestly expressing an interest in sex is punished societally and ostracized societally for doing so. And so what's concerning to me is to see this community whose whole thing is that it is a bunch of accoutrements that are added to sex to make sex more interesting or more exciting, to take a community like that and have even that community try to integrate this double standard whereby people who are overtly sexual, specifically if they are men, need to be socially ostracized in order to protect people from their sexuality, basically. In a subconscious, and I think it is very deeply subconscious, attempt collectively by lots of different people in their own little ways within kink to protect those who come to kink as a way of dealing with sexual trauma and who enjoy the formality and rigidity of rules of consent as a form of safety and protection for them. The community itself has, in an ironic twist of fate, become sex negative. I think there is a sex negative pull within kink. And so the emphasis of a community whose whole thing is kinky sex has actually been pulled away from the sex. The community itself has attempted to de-emphasize the act of sex. And in fact, if you attempt to enter the kink community, what you will find is a lot of meetings where people go to dinner and do a lot of, they hang out, they just shoot the shit as friends in completely non-sexual environments, and they just talk about things relating to kink, or they know that they're all on the same page about other things tangential to kink, like society and politics. It is actually very, very hard to find a meetup of people who are of the kink community who are trying to actually have sex with each other. You would be absolutely shocked. It's their whole thing, and yet it's not a part of what they do. I'll tell you an experience that I had to sort of illustrate. I went to a dungeon at one point to try it out. It's not something I've done a lot of, but I tried it out at one point with some friends, and I I expected an orgy. I expected everybody to be fucking each other, or at least for some people to be fucking each other. It seemed that actual sex was very strongly discouraged. And the implication was, just as I said about the restaurant before, to have actual sex in a space of this kind, one would require the consent of any onlookers, which meant that unless the party specifically said, hey everybody, this is specifically a sex party, it wasn't going to happen. So that seemed strange to me. You're at a dungeon, a BDSM dungeon, and the act of asking someone else there if they would like to have sex with you is against the rules, basically. Because if you do that, then the rest of the room has to see it, basically, right? And the rest of the room hasn't necessarily consented to that. And so we're in this space with the aesthetics of sex everywhere. There is a stripper pole, there are beds, there are ropes. But what is happening around me is not sex, it is performance. Someone was tied up in what I can only describe as a rope spin or a rope dance. It was more like when girls go up in those the loose things that hang from the ceiling, and they do the ribbon dancing, I think it's called. It was more like ribbon dancing. It was more like witnessing a very lightly homoerotic ribbon dancing performance than anything actually overtly sexual. At the same time, there was a group of people at one point in the night, later in the night, where they were using some kind of a claw device on a girl. It was clearly a guy and his girlfriend, and a third that I think they were kind of polyamorous or something. They came together, is my point. And they were kind of clustered together and relatively grouped together. And I came over and I asked the guy, because he was the one at eye level, if he'd be fine with me, if he needed help holding her down, because that was one of the things. They were holding down the legs. I was like, did you want help with that? And again, to be clear, everybody here was cool with what was happening, right? But then I go and I put my foot on her leg. So this is very non-sexual touch as far as I'm concerned. This is a very light thing. And someone else who was entirely uninvolved with what was currently happening was like, did you ask her first? And I was like, oh shit, well I guess technically I didn't. I asked the two guys who were in a direct interaction with her, who seemed to be very close to her, and she's kind of busy at the moment, right? But I'm like, I guess sorry, and it was just a very uncomfortable moment. And that was the closest I got to anything resembling an actual sexual interaction. So that was unpleasant as far as I'm concerned. I don't want any more experiences like that. The last thing I want is more dissatisfaction. It seems that a lot of the joy from this community comes from edging, both literal and metaphorical, of being right on the line of being satisfied and then being dissatisfied. For me, that is what my entire life feels like normally. What I would like is to actually reach a point of actual satisfaction for once, goddammit. So for me, being in a space where all of the aesthetics are sexual, but where no actual final act ever takes place, is the most undesirable and disturbing set of activities I could be a part of. I would rather either have sex or not have sex than do whatever that was. I feel the same way about sexting. Sexting seems like this very alienated process. To me, it is never a replacement of the actual act of sex. It is always a less than desirable alternative. It is always something one settles for. And it also, in my experience, feels like a kind of a trial period, because I find that, especially when I was younger, people might not be at a level where they're willing to have sex yet, but they might be at a level where they're willing to flirt with the idea of it, and they're willing to message about it. And so to me, it has always just felt like a trial I need to walk through to get somebody to the level of being interested in me, right? I gotta prove myself by bearing this unbearable activity of writing some shitty homoerotic romance novel. It's like I've been put to work as a paid romance novelist against my will, so that I can prove that I am sticking to the conversation long enough to break down that social wall and create a level of comfort where sex might actually take place, where for me there was never any wall. Immediate would have been fine for me. Immediate with a total stranger would have been a win for me. So I think I've talked about before this idea that conservatives have of like a culture of victimhood. And the concept of a culture of victimhood is like, well, you shouldn't get in your head that you're a victim of some or another form of oppression, because if you do, then you're not going to be motivated to take action as an individual to make your life everything that it could be. Instead, you're just going to focus on woulda, coulda, shoulda stuff. You're going to focus on all these external factors that aren't in your control, and you're going to resign yourself to your position in life. But that's not necessarily the case. And I've said before that I believe that you can absolutely, as an individual, attempt to change your life for the better and care about yourself and be a good self-helpy person who tries to better themselves and still believe that there are external societal factors holding you down. You can believe that there are oppressions of sorts making your life worse, and then still try to live the best life possible. And with this concept comes this idea I call the weaponization of asceticism. The weaponization of asceticism is where good wisdom about living your life on less gets weaponized against people who have been forced to have less for one reason or another by society. So usually, if I talk about this concept, I talk about it with leftists, and usually they're pretty much in agreement when I'm talking about class politics. Obviously, someone saying you should live with less, it sounds fine. It's fine to try and live a simple life without being too focused on big house and money and all this other stuff, all this consumerism stuff, right? Of course, it's fine to try and do that. It's a little bit less fine when it's like your boss telling you to do that, and he's telling you to do that because even though you work hard, he's not going to pay you any more than you currently make, and you probably deserve a lot more than you currently make. Right? That's a little bit different in tone. It's a little bit of a different vibe when it's being imposed upon you that you must live with less, unfairly and unjustly. So, similarly, what happens when this weaponization of asceticism is directed not at class politics, not at your wallet, not at living with less money, but living with less human connection, living with less love, sex, etc. I'll give you a great example. This is the perfect example of the weaponization of asceticism applied to sex and dating. Stop me if you've heard this before. You shouldn't need a partner to be whole. What the fuck does that mean? You shouldn't need a partner to be whole. Well, okay, yeah. I mean, I am whole. I'm a person. We're all people. But you know what? Maybe you shouldn't need food to be full. How about that? Maybe you don't need to drink water anymore. I'm just gonna take all your water away. Leave you in a desert. No, that's ridiculous. It is a perfectly normal, natural thing for the vast majority of the human species to want to have some kind of a sexual or romantic partner, and to take somebody who is complaining about that, whoever, for whatever reason, and to tell them, well, you shouldn't need a partner to be whole. Like, it's so vague. What exactly does that mean? And I can see someone being helped by it. Like, maybe if you're going through a string of monogamous relationships, you're a serial monogamist, let's say, and every time you get out of a relationship, you have a very easy time finding a new person to get into a relationship with, and so you jump right into that next relationship, and you never allow yourself time to be single or to develop who you are when you're not with somebody else. That person might need a little bit of that kind of advice. That person might need to hear, well, you don't need a relationship to be whole. But that's not who it's being said to for the most part, is it? It's not people who have relationship after relationship and can't construct an identity outside of a relationship. It's being said to people without a relationship. It's being said to people who are struggling to find anyone. I think that's super fucked up and wrong, actually. I think that's bad. And to relate this back to kink culture again, I think what disturbs me, one of the many things that disturbs me, clearly I'm making a formal list, right? One of the many things that disturbs me about kink culture is the implication that not only should you be comfortable being whole without another person, you should sexualize your own insecurities. Oh, you're insecure? Well, maybe you should develop some kind of a shame kink. Wouldn't that be fun? Yeah, have your partner shame you, right? Let's say you're fat. Let's say you're a fat person. Have your partner call you a chubby pig, right? Learn to get off on being called a chubby pig. That's a good solution, except no, it's not. For one thing, you're probably insecure for a reason. Like not always, but a lot of times you're insecure for a reason. In the example I just gave, you're insecure because being overweight does tend to make people somewhat less attractive, especially if you're extremely overweight. People use weight as a symbol of health, as an indicator of health, and if they see somebody who's morbidly obese, they're generally not attracted to them. A couple extra pounds here and there might not be a big deal, but it's also good to be healthy. That little voice in your head that wants to make a constructive change in your life for the better, lose a couple pounds, improve yourself, and be more attractive to others, be more attractive to yourself, be happier with yourself when you look in the mirror. There are some forces in this world that say, don't lean into that. Don't lean into the instinct to better yourself in life. Instead, sexualize whatever you're most ashamed of. I think that is incredibly dangerous. A lot of the modern sex-positive feminist view of porn is predicated on the idea that porn is merely a series of fantasies that we passively absorb for a period of time, and then we leave it where it was. We go into this other dimension, the porn dimension, right? And then we do whatever we do there, and we get out. It's like Vegas. What happens in the porn dimension stays in the porn dimension. Okay? But in reality, what happens in the porn dimension stays with us. We remember it, and it shapes us, and it impacts who we are as a person. And if you allow yourself to gradually acclimate yourself to a series of negative self-image beliefs, and then sexualize those negative self-image beliefs until your identity as a person is wrapped up in a kink that you've developed, and that kink is based on your own negative self-image, that's really bad, actually, right? And I think a lot of people have a lot of men, I'll say, have subconsciously noticed this. This is why the word cuck is so evocative. That's why so many people on the right wing call the left wing people cucks, right? That's what they're trying to. They don't have to articulate it like I do. They don't have to break it down like I do. They just know on a basic level, whoop, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be the cuck guy, right? And so they just use that as an insult, kind of unthinkingly, But on a deep level, what they're doing is they are saying to themselves, I am making a choice not to be a cuck. And what that means for them is to not sexualize their own shame, their own insecurity, their own flaws. They refuse to accept that that is all they have in life. They refuse to live with less. Instead, they demand more. They demand to be the bull. They demand that someday, somehow, even if it seems physically, biologically impossible at the moment, they will become the bull. And that is an attitude that actually motivates people towards positive change in their lives. That is an attitude that is constructive. I don't think it is possible for a lot of these young men who are struggling like this right now to end up believing that they can have a girlfriend and be happy if they can't believe that they are attractive enough to be the bull. It sounds absurd, but that's true on a deep level. You have to be able to believe that either you're more attractive than you think you are now, or you can be if you make more of an effort. And if you don't believe that, then you'll resign yourself, as so many of these people have, to this black pill mentality. And once you're in that mentality, oh God, that is a black hole that leads, it just churns out mass shooters, this mentality. It is the most dangerous thing to teach these men that the only path to happiness is to embrace the thing they hate the most, the thing that they're most afraid of. And that is what it feels like we are teaching. When the community spaces you're in encourage you to be polyamorous, if you're personally not inclined towards polyamory, they encourage you to just be kinky. You know, oh yeah, you're ashamed of having a small penis. Well, why don't you just make that a kink instead? It seems like that is more socially acceptable than in any way trying to alter yourself for the better. And that is dangerous as hell. In summary, the kink community could be a really good thing. There is the nugget, the potential for something that would really help and transform a lot of people's lives for the better in this community. And it is very disappointing to me that instead we have a very desexualized space, a space that encourages people to sexualize their own shame, their own insecurity, a space that is rooted so heavily in consumerism and aesthetics and fandom culture, and a space which places such a formal emphasis on rules and on problematizing people's sexuality and on this social justice-y, identity politics-y essentializing of people from the top down, instead of just emphasizing liberation of a kind. There is a kind of collective rising above your current stature that could exist if we just tried to get there. And it is in no way, I don't think, conservative. At least not in a traditional sense. Because it does require a very deep acceptance of the parts of yourself that you're uncomfortable with. And it does require a very deep trust in others to make these decisions for themselves.